Hegel's dialectical depository for spiritually elevated teens? Ah, crap, Matt, your webcam went unfocused for a second there.
Yeah, it's been doing that. I don't know why it does that, but
Yeah, that's why I've been kind of doing this sometimes.
yeah, sorry.
Try
Yeah.
turning your camera off and on.
There it goes.
What's it
Thanks,
doing?
Doug.
Yeah, that's why my mom thinks I'm a computer expert.
Well, 90% of those calls are, did you turn it off and turn it back on again?
Well,
There you go.
I know how that works. Ugh. That's my literal job.
So, we're about to go into quantum in our reading. I know I promised last time that this time I would present a little bit on his thoughts on Kant, but I didn't get to any of that because this week has been somewhat trying. So I thought I'd zoom out a bit and talk about what Hegel is doing in his system just a little bit and then see where we can take it from there. Because it's easy to get lost, and I've gotten lost, especially in this first section, meaning being, before we get to essence. And so let's see. All right. So when Hulgate writes that opening our eyes merely lets in light and gives rise to visual sensations of color. Strictly speaking, therefore, we do not actually see objects before us. All we see is a two-dimensional plane of colors. So how do we come to experience objects? We do so, Hegel claims, by understanding what we see and perceive through the other senses in terms of general concepts or categories, a term he borrows from Aristotle and Kant. Such categories for Hegel include the thoughts of something, quantity, and cause, blah, 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 blah. Why am I bringing this up? Because if you open your science of logic and you look at what it is to be in thought, as Hegel takes it logically from just sheer being, before we get to essence, in which you start to take in things in their opposition, you're basically just looking at three very, very simple things. You are, you, and in that there's quality, and then there's quantity, and there's measure, and that's the end. That's the end of the book. Okay, and this matches up very, very exactly with what Holgate just said right here. When we open our eyes, we merely let in light and it gives rise to visual sensations of color. And then we interpret them, right? But until we bring our understanding to bear on what we see is processed as bare quality, quantity, and measure. And then going into essence, we start comparing things as opposed to just, and so that is why it's such an austere volume or book of the logic to get through. There's not much to it, and the determinations are what they are in themselves, and they all turn over into something else, as opposed to, so they have their being in themselves, right? And of course, this turns out to be a complete underdetermination, as we find out much, much later. That's not actually how reality works, but in the logical unfolding, that's how it seems, it appears that being works. Okay. And so we go through and we have sheer being, and then we have determinate being, which is the negative, the negation. And then we have being for self, which is self-referential being. In other words, being that is finds its infinite in itself, basically. I went through the let's see. I went through the lectures on the section on being, quality and measure. Did anyone else kind of take a look? No, that's okay.
Skip
I
through it.
yeah, I'll skip ahead. I actually found the explanations in here very helpful. I want to say, when you read this, ignore Butler, ignore the introduction at the beginning, ignore the notes that he writes. Some of the notes he writes are wrong, very wrong. Some of them I found actually contradict exactly what Hegel says on the page, like right under it. And I'm sitting here, wait a minute, that's the opposite of what he said. And then I have to go back and reread the passage and the passage before that. And I said, okay, I got the logic right. Butler is wrong. I don't know why he's reversing it or doing whatever the hell he's doing, but so you have to watch out, because Butler also introduces in the lectures bracketed items that are not in the original text, that clarify what Hegel is saying. And for the most part, so far, I found that they match up. But sometimes I have to reread it without the brackets, and then it makes more sense. Usually when I read it without the brackets, it actually comes off as sounding like the science of logic right off the page or out of the encyclopedia. So Butler is an unreliable translator, unfortunately, and I think I read Houlgate and Harrison say that, and at least one other person. Butler has his own axe to grind where Hegel is concerned, and he's been critiqued elsewhere. But at least he translated, you know, this for us, so we don't have to go read or learn German. So, some of the things that I found when reading this, and I found really helpful, is that I figured out that instead of looking at the becoming as sort of like a black box, a manifold in which to grok the next transformation, the next transition, I found it much easier to picture it, especially when he talks about the finite and the infinite. I know we've been over this material before, but the lectures just make it so much easier. Let's see here. Yeah, like, I'm just going to read off some quotes and we can talk about them or not, and we'll go from there. So Hegel says, the circle of becoming is the first concrete determination, and upon analysis, it gives two abstract determinations, being and nothing. Now this is those are in brackets. The concrete and the abstract are in brackets. So that's Butler. Being results from the fact that all determinate content has gone back into the simple oneness of being. This being is being by the fact that anything particular and determinate has negated itself. Being is not and cannot be except by the negation of everything particular. So basically, he's talking about the universal absolute that being is, that's generated by the absolute in our heads, but we don't know that yet within the argument. Being taken abstractly for itself has no truth but this abstraction, this negation of what is determinate. We are not permitted to leave out of a result that from which it has resulted. Being has resulted from a negation, and this negation therefore belongs to it. So in this section, he's talking about the eletics and whatnot. And anyway, this is going back. But let's see. I haven't read the Heraclitus, but the way he puts it in the lecture, he gives the background, because he says that the being and nothing and becoming were basically the coming into being and going out of being that we talked about all the way at the beginning. And he says these categories greatly occupied the ancients. The pantheism of the Eletics of being denies both coming into being and going out of being. Rather, being alone holds truth. Out of what, the Eletics asked, is something to arise. From the nothing nothing can come, and so on and so forth. And then he goes on to Heraclitus, and Heraclitus said that the principle is becoming or process. He said that everything flows, or that being is no more than nothing itself. And this speculative opinion caused the reproach to be raised against Heraclitus of a certain obscurity, since his principle proves difficult for the understanding, which it is. The understanding cannot basic common sense that holds something fast and its a determinate being apart from other determinate beings cannot see how that they are coextensive. Okay, and let's see. The process invoked by Heraclitus has won through him its place in the history of philosophy. Heraclitus said in a physicalistic mode that his principle was fire, which is simple unrest, becoming, passing away. This unrest, like the pulsation of blood, is the very principle of everything that is alive. Heraclitus also says that time is the principle, that time is this same becoming, that in time we find only another way of intuiting becoming. Like when he says intuiting, he means feeling. We can feel, we can like feel our way through. And so with fire and time, we experience the becoming intuitively. In space, everything is side by side, but what is now, even as I pronounce it, is no more, and so on and so forth. And, you know, being alive is that same feeling. Spirit is the same unrest, the pure process of being alive within itself. And then he goes into Dasein. He gets to the end of the section on Dasein, and you get into the limit and what amounts to finitude. Some sections of these lectures are long. There are quite a few digressions, but he gets up to the point where he talks about finitude and infinitude, and then to say that something is finite is to say it is alterable. When we say that things are finite, our statement seems the result of accidental observation, but the finitude of things belongs to their necessary nature. So they're limited by their nature, not by some external force, right? Finitude lies upon something insofar as the thing is contradictory through the self-negation which constitutes the very determination to which it is destined. Something posited negatively is something else. It thus lies within the very determination of something to alter itself into something else. The negation of something's being upon itself lies upon something else. So the negation of something is something different from it. It is something else. We've been down this road. With this development posited upon itself or upon something, it is alterable. So something becomes something else and still something else again, ever onward. And now we see the infinite begin to emerge into view. And this is the bad infinity where the positing should turn over into a negative, but it does not. It keeps turning over back into a positive, right? In the infinite series.
I think for Hegel, one of his analogies was that difference between a straight line and a circle. A straight line represents the bad infinite, and the circle is the good infinite.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah. And this is what he says at the end. He says, but all of this is quite generally the doing of the understanding. The bad infinite is through and through a beyond, never anything present, sort of like the communist horizon for these democratic socialists. Fact of the matter is that something positive comes to be recognized as equally something negative. Its negation comes to be negated by something positive again. That's the bad infinity. And this makes for the second negation. The infinite beyond itself is negated since something finite emerges anew out of it. Thus, negation of the negation is at hand. What we take to be the infinite, but it's a bad infinite, finitude emerges again from it, right? But negation of the negation is affirmation. What is negated is also itself a negation. Negation of the negation bears reference to another negation, which it negates. Thus, we have negation referring to itself and referring to its object. And this self-reference is affirmation. This sort of affirmation is our first example of the true infinite. What lies within our consciousness is that both the finite and the false infinite represented as beyond it have been negated. When I say negated, I just mean negated by themselves. They become part of the true infinite as a unity of the finite and the bad infinite. So, something along those lines.
And I think it also gets into concepts of God.
Well,
the traditional theistic concept of God is the bad infinite, whereas the kind of Spinozan concept of God that Hegel adhered to was the good infinite.
Yeah. Yeah. Within the lecture, whenever he mentions God, and he does here and there, usually it's to knock down a previous concept of God. He says, he does say that God is the absolute, but he doesn't go down any theistic routes. He stays pretty solidly on the thought determinations whenever bringing it up, and honestly, I think it's almost an artifact of the audience he was talking to at the time it was written. You know what I mean? Like for them, it's probably on the tip of the tongue that God is all. God is, everything. But the conception, when you're talking about God in various contexts in that era, fell into various problems, limitations, and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So he says, with the true infinite, the stupendous question of the opposition of the finite and the infinite is resolved. Dualism holds fast to the opposition of the infinite and the finite, and the understanding is on the whole dualistic, as in the ancient Persian representation of light and darkness, as in Manichaeism. God and the devil, good and evil, good is the infinite and evil is thoroughly finite. The resolution lies in an examination of the determinations already at hand. We have on the one hand the finite, the entire world, finite world, and to the other side the infinite. So there are two sides, with the infinite merely off to one side. As long as that is how matter stands, the finite stands outside the infinite, which of course is wrong. The infinite is thus not what it ought to be, since the finite is outside it. And with that, the infinite is itself finite and limited. By literally having the finite outside it, it is no longer logically, you cannot think of the infinite if the finite is opposed to it as infinite, is what he's saying. Yes. Blah, 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 blah. So yeah, bottom line, if you want to understand finitude and the infinite better in his system, within that context, go and read this section of the book. It's around page like 106 to 110, something like that, and he takes you through it rather pedantically. Much better, honestly, than what he writes in the book. But in the book, he's trying to be very economic with his argument, which I find hilarious because it's still such a long book. One thing he does say that I find interesting is that he says the Spinozistic determination of infinity, by which infinity is the unlimited affirmation of any matter, is one-sided, since it does not include infinity as negation of the negation. Now, I haven't read the Spinoza far enough to know whether this is the case or not, but you'd have to ask Harrison. He's got a handle on both. Yeah. So for the audience too, that this is a great passage. Examples of the true infinite are life, the self, whatever has being for itself. I am myself, since I am at once there and am something other than myself. And in that I am for myself. I negate the other for whom I am as other and posit the other as something ideal. I raise up its independence beyond itself. Now, when I say this, does everyone know what I mean when I say this? When I say, but in that I am for myself, I negate the other for whom I am as other and posit the other as something ideal. I raise up its independence beyond itself. What did I just say? Anyone? Paraphrase.
And so kind of just being in yourself, you've gone through you go through this ablation process for sure to become more of yourself, but you've become it more consciously.
No, that's
Nope.
that's not what he's saying.
Yeah.
So I'm raising this all the way up to the concrete standard to help you understand. But when he says, but in that I am for myself, I negate the other as other and posit the other as something ideal. I raise up its independence beyond itself. So I walk down the street and I see a rock, okay? And the rock is my other. And I bring it into my brain, right, as the other, as something ideal. It becomes an ideal rock in my head. I have raised up its independence that's outside of me and created a thought rock in my head that is no longer independent of me, but is part of who I am. The rock is now part of who I am as a rock thought, because it's connected with the rest of my brain that's cognizing it. It's taking it in, right? Quality, quantity, measure, straight from my eyes. That's what he means. And this process is the entirety of the logic. You zoom out and you see what thought is as being. All you're doing is opening your eyes and you see quality, you see quantity, and you see measure. And then in essence, the inner you is taking all that you see and starting to compare it, to contextualize it, which is why you have all of the antinomies in the Essence book, right? Cause and effect is a big one, right? Another one that's already covered is finitude and infinity, although it's, it's less of it's less of it's more of a universal. They're more like universal categories. But so you're taking the other in, and you're starting to cognize it. And then in the category book, the third book, you return to yourself from the outside world with the information. You cognize it, and it becomes notions. I have a full notion of the rock. I have a full notion of Doug Green sitting over there with all his books behind him, right? I'm not just looking at a flat plane of color and quality, and there's only one Doug there. There's not three or four. Although, if I sit here long enough, there might be four lights, right? So that's the structure. It's very, very basic, but the way he talks about it is just so yeah. I'm going to keep reading here because okay, so yes, because I am infinite, right? The self, because I am infinite, I negate the other within me. In other words, the other, the rock, let's say, stops being a rock by itself and becomes a rock along with all the other stuff in my head, right? And that's just a really vulgar, rough explanation that I'm sure others would argue with, but that's how I took it. As a subject in the real world, I'm finite. Inside my head, I'm infinite. So as a subject, I am finite, and in consciousness, I run up against the object of consciousness as the border that contains me. But already by the fact that I represent the object to myself, the content of the object is mine. The rock is mine, right? It belongs to me, and so its independence of me is negated, and any behavior toward its behavior toward myself. I am myself an example of true infinity, but a true infinity that is still abstract. Then he says, life is a true infinite. I breathe in oxygen, and with the air around me, I reach the borderline of my being. In negating the air, I negate it insofar as it is other than myself. I cause the other, the oxygen, to be mine by breathing it in. I transform food, equally negating it as other than myself, and in doing so, I produce and reproduce myself. Does this start to help bring some of this into focus?
So kind of like phenomenology, but even more, it's the same relative process. Yeah.
Well, it's exactly the same, because in phenomenology, you're talking about consciousness starting to figure out what it is in itself, and what we're talking about here are the categories of thought, starting from being and going logically in that direction. He says, spirit is a true infinite. In its higher form, the true infinite is reconciliation. One makes the other over into oneself. Love and friendship are examples of the infinite for spirit. As a single person, I have being for myself in total rigidity. The other person is also rigid and hostile, but in reconciliation, I make the other over into myself. Basically, he's talking about culture, human interaction, and how spirit, as a true infinite, interacts with itself among its individuals. Again, the one and the many, right? The many in the culture, and the one, and this his discussion of one and the many also spills over into the philosophy of right. We have one law, but we have many who have needs. The many who have needs are what creates the law, which regulates the many, and so forth. It goes back and forth dialectically in his exposition, but it's all basically the same thing. When he talks about the one and the many of being, it's very much applicable to state and civil society, which he builds up in the philosophy of right. And he says, our knowledge of nature also illustrates the infinite. He says he leaves aside here any claim that reason belongs merely to me. He transfers reason over into nature, while nature leaves to the side its own show of being something merely external or irrational. The other of nature, the self, knows in nature its other, knows that it is the same as the other. Spirit lies in the capacity for accommodation with the other and the ability to assimilate it. In other words, a person out in the woods knows how to assimilate his surroundings. You know, he's familiar with nature. He is of nature. You hope, anyway. In no way is the other hostile to spirit. Nature is reconcilable with spirit, is what he's saying. A free man can bear up in the face of an other, can remain at rest with himself, even in being with it. Then he says, something as found in the physical world fails to maintain its presence in the face of the other. When I bring two objects together in the mechanical sphere, they collide into each other in the chemical sphere. And, you know, this is kind of repeating stuff that we've already hit a little bit, but it's him giving the lecture as opposed to being on the page, which makes it a lot easier. So that is what the true infinite is. It is the foundation. What lies further is knowledge of this infinity in its more concrete forms. The understanding holds finitude and infinity apart from each other and is persuaded that it holds the infinite entirely clear of the finite. The finite is thereby itself made into an absolute. The great self-deception of the understanding is to claim that we cannot reach the infinite. The understanding would make the infinite into what finite into what lasts, where in fact the finite is but a transition of the truth of itself to the infinite. So that's kind of where he goes with that. Mentions the two negations again. Yeah, it's a long section on the finite and the infinite, but talks about Plato. And then he gets to being for self. All right. I've probably talked for half an hour. He says the one, okay. The one is itself the act of making reference negatively to itself, and it is thus the repulsion of further ones from itself, the positing of many ones. So the many ones are generated by the self-reference that says, I am one. I'm not a part of that over there, right? And so logically, you are the isolated one, but in saying that you're isolated from what? And there's a reference outside yourself, and those are the many. And he says the truth of the many is the one. This observation could not be simpler. What is the many? The first, the second, and the third are each a many. But alternatively, the first one is in the many is a one. The second one is likewise a one, and so on. Thus, the first, second, and third are each and all the same. They are each the one. Nothing could be simpler. He says this a couple times, like, hello, that, you know, this is not a hard thing. The repulsion of the one from itself is the being of the many. Exclusion is a form of reference. It is reference to the affirmative determination of positing another one. The many in negating the one each negate what each of them is, and so they negate themselves, or rather that to which they refer is the one, and they all refer to it. In its repulsion of another one from itself, the one bears reference to itself as the one. Repulsion is thus attraction, reversal of the many into the one, right?
Kind of almost feels like you got the finite when it comes in the many to each individual one, but they're also interrelated, so they're also infinity too. At the same
Right, right. And the finite and the infinite do come in, but again, the one and the many are shapes of the being for self, whereas the finite and the infinite are shapes of the um, determinate being. So the finite and the infinite are both contained as a unity by accents, I guess you could say, within the one and the many.
right.
Something like that.
It is always just interesting to see echoes of sublated earlier forms pop back up.
They absolutely do. They're guaranteed to. You're not going to find them not popping back up. Is what I would like to say. And he gets into atomism a little bit. And when you're reading the sections where he goes into like atomistic philosophy, don't mistake our atomic physical analytics for atom philosophy in the Greek um, context, because they're not the same. Uh, a lot of the way it's described sounds the same and acts the same, but it's not exactly, because in the atomistic philosophy, for instance, the atoms are all alike. What reigns is accident, right? Absolutely no determination of a concrete manifold lies within any of them. The existence of an atomic manifold is thus mere accident, entirely devoid of thought, purely external to any given atom. The atomists asserted the many and the void, and held that the atoms bear reference to one another by way of mutual exclusion. An atomism of more recent vintage speaks of molecules. Atomism is driven into minute particles into a oneness empty of internal qualitative differentiation, which of course is not where we are. We've got quite a manifold going so far. The opposite forces, and here again is the unity. The opposite forces, so-called, of repulsion and attraction are inseparable. If one represents to oneself the flow of the many ones by their mutual attraction into a single one, every new one enters the representation. Precisely this is what is meant by saying that attraction is at once repulsion and once the production at once the production of new ones, right? One imagines that something new comes out of attraction, or seeing that there are, after all, many ones, it is asked how attraction emerges between them. Attraction is present in the many ones like the weight of gravity, since the accursed manyness of ones never reaches its truth in a single one. Okay, yeah, he's still talking about atomism and just basically saying, here's atomism and here's how it should really work. Here it is. Atomism comes forth in the political sphere as well. A people consists in many individual wills, which make up a general will. The singular is here too the principle. The attractive force bringing individuals together, and that's Clark Butler, lies in the individual's needs, inclinations, and social actions for the sake of utility. Beyond such atomism, substance, reason, the will upon itself, right, and justice are the foundation in the political sphere. All these categories being categories of being for itself, which, in attraction, the raising up of being many beyond itself into something else, into the one, is posited. In attraction, the one refers to what is qualitatively itself, and with that, the logic of quality is raised up beyond itself into the logic of quantity. Being for itself is quality in its developed totality, the full determination of a being that endures without further qualitative alteration. The raising up of what is qualitative into what is quantitative raises it up into a new non-qualitative determination. It is the determination of a qualitative indifference of ones in increasing or decreasing quantity. If we now look about to see how this new determination presents itself in representation, we find it present in representations of quantity. And then he goes on. Yeah. And then he goes on into quantity, continuous and discrete. Then he goes into quantum and number and oneness. And he goes into the three arithmetic operations, counting, yeah. Basically, I mean, your basic, third grade math class, adding, subtracting, dividing, multiplying, and yeah, and the last one he talks about is ratio, where with degrees and whatnot. So all this is pretty simple, and it's logically derived from the shapes and the relations prior to this. And then you go into measure. I'm not trying to leap ahead or anything. I know quantum is quite a long chapter, and I do want us to read it.
I found the exposition in the lectures on logic to be much clearer than either the science of logic or even the encyclopedia.
Yeah. What I found with these, as long as I'm holding Clark Butler at a reasonable arm's length, is that when Hegel talks to you in the lectures, and then you go and read the book, I mean, the book is clear as day. But without the lectures, the book is difficult because he really does not want to sully the logical argument with commentary. And this is laughable, actually, because there is lots of commentary within the book itself. Commentary on Kant, on Descartes, on all these guys, not always by name. In the phenomenology of spirit, he's notorious for not dropping names, but simply describing whatever their work is. And so you need a guide sometimes. And sitting here, I want to read some of it to you, and I find my biggest problem is that I don't take notes. I don't take notes on anything, and so I find something I want to read you guys, and then I bypass it completely. Let's see here. Yeah, in the phenomenology, in the preface, he kind of lays out why he's going in the direction that he's going. And one of the things he says, this is 20, the true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself. Though it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set the show of contradictions in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, as at first immediately enunciated, is only the universal. Just as when I say all animals, this expression cannot pass for a zoology. It can't. So it is equally plain that the words the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc., do not express what is contained in them, and only such words, in fact, do express the intuition as something immediate. Think about that. The intuition is something immediate. You go into the church, you sit down, praise be to God, right? And that they're slamming these universals at you, and maybe you read your book, maybe you didn't, but at the end of the day, it amounts to that sort of abstraction that continues as an abstraction. It's immediate and it's intuited by hearing it, right? Whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back or as a mediation, right? But it is just this that is rejected with horror, as if absolute cognition were being surrendered when more is made of mediation than in simply saying that it is nothing absolute and is completely absent in the absolute. So yeah, picture thinking, religious thinking does not like you to reason out what is actually before us and what we're capable of. It wants to hand you what it thinks the world is, and just tell you to be a good robot and accept whatever the clergy said. This preface is just full of great nuggets. Right, and I know everybody here has read it at one point or another. We're 7 minutes out. I'm pretty sure I've been talking 90% of the time.
Yep.
Kyle, you got anything? Jim?
Well, I guess I was going to say right quick, I did read enough about the second antinomy and what it went over. It kind of seemed interesting. Like this is because way he compared composition and similar, or sorry, and simples, end
Yeah.
up being like a perfect example of why you just don't blanket do unity of opposites, because the problem was they're not opposites. The unity and similars and composites are interrelated directly versus like simples in which is discretes in continuity, are actually opposites.
Mm.
That was ultimately, I guess, the core issue with Kant's second antinomy, was the composite was really dependent on the definition of simple, because composite is just an external relation to simples, so you just loop back upon yourself.
There it is. There it is. Wow. Okay. So there's a section in Capital Volume 1 where Marx talks about simple labor and complex labor at some point. And he basically says, we're not going to talk about complex labor because it can be broken down into units of simple labor. And so for the purposes of his exposition, he's only going to talk about the simple labor. because, that, that completes the discussion without getting more concrete. If you talk about complex labor, you're talking about a more complex determination in a real factory, which, maybe you employ like 50 guys who perform the simple labor and like maybe 5 guys who do the complex labor, which includes coordinating the simple labor, something like that. And then you can make your concrete calculation from there. But whether that shape is that or another different shape, the way that it works, or the way that capitalism works, can be calculated using the simple labor. And in fact, it gives you everything you need to make the more complex calculation later if you need it. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
so, and so you look at the antinomy that that Kant has of like the composite versus the simple, and you're being asked, you're being told that these are so opposed, right? When it's obvious that the simple makes up what is composite, in any formation, anything you can think of, including especially that from Marx, you can see, I mean, what else? Ask the question, what else would you build the composite out of other than the simple parts that become the composite, right? But yeah, okay, now I'm going to have to go and read that section really closely. That's actually really cool. Yeah.
We mentioned Hegel's discussion of atomism and his application of atomism to political philosophy, and basically he talks about atomism in political philosophy is basically, I think, referencing the liberalism as it developed out of Hobbes and Locke, because they conceived everything in terms of each individuals as like basically as atoms, and you build the civil society and the state from those atoms. Then you get to Rousseau. Rousseau talks about the general will, and I think Hegel is trying to show how you get from the atomism and liberalism to Rousseau's general will.
I mean, philosophy of right is not explicitly but implicitly Republican.
Yeah.
Since it's only through the legislature that the people can, enact laws and rule. And, in that, and that therefore enact the general will. At least, that's my reading of it. And that's also Viewig's reading in his recent biography.
Yeah.
Change the subject a little bit. Matt talked about the relationship of the self and nature, and I was sort of reminded of Frederick Engel's discussion of freedom and necessity, and the anti-Düring. Basically says when we achieve freedom once we understand how we're governed by necessity, and we can take that knowledge of necessity and apply it to change in the world. So we're no longer governed by like what we call blind necessity. We're governed by necessity made conscious.
You're right. Or yeah, you're right. Engels are right. And we talked about this in a different study group, that if you actually want to change the world, you actually do need to know things. You need to know the rules, the laws, how society functions. You need to have an actual conception of objective reality. And to put it at like the most base practical level, you can't wage warfare without actually knowing how the world works, how your weapons work, how your soldiers work, all of this. Otherwise, if you're doing it, thinking if you just, put pixie dust on yourself that you can like charge another army and be invincible, well, that's not going to actually work. Maybe you need armor. Maybe you can outflank somebody. because knowledge of objective reality gives you power, the power to actually influence events. And that's why you actually, like, there is a direct correlation from the rational monistic conception of the world to how Trotsky and Lenin formed the Soviet state and the Red Army. Because otherwise, if it's just based on, creating your own facts or something, it just doesn't work. You can't actually win a war like that. Yes, deception and all that is part of war. But ultimately, if consciousness of necessity does give you freedom, and the more knowledge you have of objective reality, the more power you have to actually influence it. That's why reason is red, as Fluss and Frim state.
And also, I'm reminded back during the Iraq War, I think some journalist quoted one of the officials of the Bush administration saying that what distinguishes us, we create our own facts, we create our own reality, and that's a delusion of imperialism, really.
Yeah.
And we know how it ended. The Iraq War did not
It's subjective
well.
idealism all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascist conceit as well that, we just can will it. We can impose by fiat what things are. And, ultimately, maybe that can work for a little while, but it's like Wile E. Coyote walking off a cliff. You're going to look down sooner or later and you're going to fall.
Yeah. I think there's a strand of the Palestinian resistance online that talks about how Israel is ultimately failing in its conquering of Gaza. And I think materially, I mean, I'm not there, so I don't really know, but I think materially, unfortunately, they're absolutely laying waste to Gaza. On the other hand, they're for lack of a better way to put it, I think of it kind of like the Chicago boys who went down to South America to start doing their little experiments in Chile and other places, and how those experiments did bear fruit. And I think Israel is conducting an experiment. How far can I get away with this, right? And I don't know. I don't have any hope in international bodies trying to do something about it. I have a lot more hope in the Houthis. It's kind of like looking at Vietnam. I look at what happened in Vietnam and how under the worst possible conditions, the Vietnamese drove us out, and we were the more materially ready to just kill and destroy, right? Eventually, yeah. What Hegel is saying about self-consciousness, that eventually needs to happen with the international Gazan resistance. They need to figure out newer and better ways to resist the Israeli terror and eventually defeat it. And I hope they do before things get much worse. We were just talking about this last week in our meeting with who was it, Doug? Who did we meet with? It's not the Red Strike Project. It's
It was
something.
the Firebrand people.
Firebrand. Yeah, there we go. Everybody has their own cute little names, and they all run together for me.
It's okay.
Red Strike, ISO, Kasama, all of it just
thankfully Kasama doesn't exist anymore. Red Strike, it looks like, is dissolving. So although they're still going to be moving on to wherever, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, also if you think about it, this comes up, in any guerrilla struggle as well. And this, I think, relates, I hope it relates to Hegel, is what is it going to take for that self-consciousness to win, right? And I think ultimately it does. For freedom, you do need a socialist program. You need some kind of something to that effect, and your strategy to win is going to flow from that.
Yes. And it's funny you say that, because it does absolutely dovetail with what Hegel is saying, because when Hegel talks about infinity in the earlier section, and he talks about and let me just bring it up real quick, because he
I was also
says,
going to say, it's like, I think probably most Red Army soldiers did not read Hegel, but in the same way that Napoleon's army had like potentially a marshal's baton on their back, I think the Red Army had Hegel's logic in their knapsack, at least in spirit or Geist.
yeah, spirit is a true infinite. Infinite. In its higher form, the true infinite is reconciliation. One makes the other over into oneself. Love and friendship are examples of the infinite. As a single person, I have being for myself in total rigidity. The other person is also rigid and hostile, but in reconciliation, I make the other over into myself. What's the other word that we can use in our context to refer to reconciliation? Solidarity. Organization among many different people to resist. And I mean, from Hanoi all the way down the peninsula, that is exactly what they did. They reconciled to themselves the general will and built it to be much stronger than the half-assed will of the imperial invaders, and they won. Not without cost, but I mean, what else are you going to do?
They paid a horrendous cost to do that.
Negotiating with terrorists is a horrible thing, and is what I would agree with Bush about, but I would posit that he lies on the wrong side of that equation. Yeah. Most of the rest of the being book with quantity, once you get into number all the way to the end of measure, is really just, it's really just math. It's working with the world through numbers, or numbers that are like ratios, that quantums that are no longer immediate to themselves. Here we go. So like the number 5, we can look at the number 5 and we say, okay, the number 5 is what it is. But if I put 5 in a ratio of 5/2, it's no longer 5 with a being for itself. It's a 5 with a being for an other. Something along those lines. The actual measure, or the actual number that you're looking at when you look at 5/2 is 5 related to 2 in such a way that it, anyway, I don't know enough to say it properly, but when you get into measure, he says, within a quantitative ratio, I'm just going to read it out. Within a quantitative ratio, every quantum becomes determinate only through the other quantum within the same ratio. So he's basically saying what I just said. The self-reference of each quantum to itself through its reference to the other on the other side of the line is thus posited, a determinate oneness of different quanta with each other, in which each quantum has its sense only insofar as it is inseparable from the other term. It's in unity with the other term, right? Only at this level, we can see the numbers. We can write them down on the page. We're not just talking about abstract thought categories, back in quality, that are hard to get our hands on. They're very slippery. But here we can see roughly the same ones at a higher level doing this stuff on the math page, right? So let's see, blah 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 blah. Inseparable from the other term. This absence of separation between quanta, their determinate oneness, their self-reference through reference to each other, is precisely what is qualitative within the quantitative ratio itself. In this way, within measure, higher up, quantity and quality are already united. Right? So if you want a picture of what measure is, just think of what the ratio is and think about how the two numbers relate to each other qualitatively within the quantity, right? And suddenly it jumps out at you. A quantum is posited amid the externality of ones as qualitatively bearing reference to itself alone. It has being for itself lying on its very surface and is the negation of different alternate quanta. This unity of a sensory qualitative determination and a quantitative determination constitutes a measure. A quantum within a particular ratio can be altered, but such quantitative alteration within a ratio is not by itself a qualitative alteration of the ratio. Yet when the measure changes, the quality of the ratio contained in that measure also changes. The externality of quantity attains to its truth only in the quantitative ratio is something qualitative. A measure is a quantum with quality already exhibited on the very face of it. The absolute is a measure. Everything is a measure. And he goes on. An example is the paradox of the bald head. Apologies to everybody like me who's starting to, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. All right. Well, then let's wrap up. Sorry. I started running toward the next mile marker. Sorry, Doug. Yeah. So, what do you guys feel comfortable doing for the next time? You, Kyle, you pretty much covered the antinomy part. Where were we in the actual reading?
I think we just got through pure quantity, so at quantum.
Okay. So
Find good.
So why don't we open up our chapters to chapter 2 on page 202, and I'll write this down later, but just the beginning of chapter 2, and we'll read through uh-oh. How about 10 pages? We'll read chapter 2 quantum, and we'll read a number and through to the end of the first remark. So that's 212, 202 to 212. Can everybody handle that? Most of that is just math. It's just the arithmetic operations going on, is what I think it is. Remark 1, the species of calculation in arithmetic, semicolon, consynthetic propositions a priori of intuition. So yeah, 10 pages worth of math, and not very hard math at that. Sound good?
Yeah.
I'm good?
I'll get
Okay,
ahead
great.
on this too, so.
Yeah.
And
All right.
no, we'll need it.
Yeah. And we'll go from there. Thanks, everybody. And next week we'll meet at 8 o'clock. Sorry to push it back. My mother-in-law just got home from the recovery place tonight, and I was asked to help, and that went long. So you know how it is, family and whatnot. Anyway, love and peace, comrades. Have a good week.